Joining us now is Congressman James Walkinshaw, Democrat from Virginia. He is a member of the House Oversight Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for making the trek in the ice still that's happening here in the DMV. 50% of the documents, that seems like a lot. So what we're supposed to take from that, I assume, is that the DOJ is saying the rest of this does not have to be released because it comports with the law, and that at the end of the day, these redactions can happen. I want to read from, you know this, but on lists the kinds of documents that can be withheld based on the Epstein Files Transparency Act. They can be withheld based on victim privacy, child sexual abuse materials, active federal investigations, graphic content, and national security. Blanche said that he would comply with informing Congress on explanations for each of the documents withheld, but he also added that some of them were not released because of attorney-client privilege. That one seems very confusing to me. That is not on this list I just read.
Yeah, right. The law doesn't allow for that. And the delta of 3 million files, right? So Blanche said there were 6 million. 3 million have been released. Of that 3 million, they're heavily redacted, right? So the redactions aren't even counted in that 50%. Blanche has said that they over-collected when they got to the 6 million files. The law doesn't allow them to refuse to release files that subjectively Donald Trump's personal lawyer believes were over-collected. They got to release all the files, all 6 million that are in their possession, with the appropriate redactions. And I have a lot of questions about the volume and the extent of the redactions, even in the 3 million we've received.
And they have 15 days from the end of their release, based on the law, to then explain all those redactions to Congress.
That's right.
This parallel investigation that oversight you and the committee have been conducting in terms of subpoenaing associates of Jeffrey Epstein and trying to essentially replicate the work of the Justice Department by obtaining as many documents as you guys can. Can you give us an update on where that stands, if you've received any new materials that you guys are going through, any new subpoenas that have gone out?
We haven't received new materials, and there aren't new subpoenas. However, we do have depositions scheduled with Epstein's accountant and his attorneys, the attorneys for his estate, in the coming weeks. And my hope is, as we go through these 3 million files, that we'll get information that can help guide the questions we ask of those individuals. One of the things that we have been working very hard to do as oversight Democrats is follow the money, because I'm not confident, we're not confident that the FBI in their initial investigations of Epstein did a good enough job of following the money. There were millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars involved in this sex trafficking, this child sex trafficking ring, and we need to understand what financial institutions were involved, how were they involved, who knew what was going on, and following the money is the best way to do that.
A lot was released yesterday. Was it like 120,000 pictures, 3 million documents, and all of that. Of the materials that were released that you were actually able to take a look at, anything new, anything jump out at you as either concerning or new, or maybe not a bombshell, but something that gets you, and therefore us, closer to the truth?
Well, I think we learned yesterday that there are some high-profile individuals who haven't been truthful about the extent of their communications and involvement with Epstein, right? Elon Musk, Howard Lutnick, Steve Bannon corresponding with Epstein in 2019. Right, everybody knew what Epstein had done by 2019, and then obviously
Peter Attia,
that's right, yeah, others, and obviously and you know, it's fair to say unverified allegations against President Trump that are included, and some of those have been made public before and have been evaluated by the media and others. Some are new. I think they all deserve scrutiny, and we need to run them all down. And if they're false, okay, they're false. One of them in the subscript said, you know, the woman who made the allegation was not credible. And I want to learn more about that as someone who has worked on sexual and domestic violence issues. I have a lot of questions anytime an investigator says that a woman coming forward is not credible. So I think we need to explore all of those and understand fully whether they were investigated to the extent they needed to be.
Can we actually stay on that topic for a second? Because Donald Trump is also mentioned extensively throughout all these documents. A lot of that information, though, has not been corroborated.
That's right.
Is there anything in particular that stands out to you that is at the top of the list in terms of trying to pin down that information, verify it, and corroborate it?
Well, I think one way we could verify and corroborate it or not would be to have some of the FBI's statements, right, or the statements that survivors and those making allegations submitted to the FBI. What we have in the files is a summary, a spreadsheet basically summarizing them. We don't have the written statements that were taken. We don't have transcripts of interviews that were conducted. So I think that could help us learn more.
Okay.
I want to play something from Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche. He's the former personal attorney of the president, who said and claimed that the White House played no role in the Epstein file review. Let's play that.
Look, my team has certain communications with the White House. Let me just be clear. They had nothing to do with this review. They had no oversight over this review. They did not tell this department how to do our review, what to look for, what to redact, what to not redact.
That is difficult to believe for those of us who have been paying attention and have eyeballs and ears, because this president, at the very least, has made very implicit direction to the DOJ on Epstein, talking about who he thinks should be investigated, talking about that, saying what he thinks his relationship with Epstein was. Yeah. Do you trust that the White House had no hand in this? There was also reporting, and I think, as a matter of fact, Susie Wiles said herself in a Vanity Fair article that she had talked to Attorney General Pam Bondi about some of this.
Two things I would say. I want to see the Deputy Attorney General answer that question under oath, and I think perhaps in a future Congress he'll be asked to do that. But the other thing, look, the way this administration operates, and I won't compare it to any other kinds of organizations, but people know what the boss wants. Mm-hmm. So the boss doesn't necessarily have to always explicitly direct it. That's the way this administration operates, and that might have been the case here.
As a former New Yorker, we would call that mob talk.
You said it, not me.
Politico reported that the House Judiciary Committee has scheduled a hearing with Attorney General Pam Bondi on February 11th, so in just a couple of weeks. She might as well be on the side of a milk carton when it comes to the Epstein file release. One, why do you think she hasn't been anywhere near this? And two, what do you hope your colleagues on the Judiciary Committee will ask her?
Well, look, Pam Bondi is on the ropes inside the administration. I think that's been widely reported. The president's frustrated with her inability to explain the inexplicable, in my opinion. So they're frustrated with her public appearances. I want to understand, and I think the Judiciary Committee Democrats will get to this. Why didn't they follow the law? The law was very clear about the deadline. The law was very clear. Right? That's right. We're long past that. The law was very clear about the redactions. They did not follow the law. They have not followed the law. Why? She needs to be asked that question.
Congressman James Walkinshaw, please come back, especially if you're able to actually ultimately see these redacted documents and tell us what you're not supposed to be telling us about them. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you all. Yeah.
President Trump continues to spread falsehoods and outright lies related to his 2020 election defeat. And now his director of national intelligence is getting involved. Up next, we'll ask Maine's Secretary of State what that could mean for the midterms. Plus, you can listen